In 2006, my family and I moved into an old house. It was at least 90 years old and was in pretty good condition for a house that old. My parents bought the house as it was near the middle school I'd be attending and was convenient for both of my parents to get to work on time. Most of the time, I'd be home after I got out of school as my parents would still be working. I mean, sometimes one of them would get off early and come home, but that was rare. My parents didn't feel a need to get me a babysitter as I was 11, which some may argue as being too young to stay home alone, but I'd like to think of myself as mature and responsible. On top of that, being home alone would also guarantee some me time to get things done. Whether it be doing homework, playing video games, or even just neatening up the house, there'd always be something to do. One day, my parents had told me that they wouldn't be back until much later as my mom was going to go out with some friends and my dad was working overtime. I didn't mind it, of course, and told them to go do their thing and told myself that I would just treat this night like any other night I was home alone. On this night, there happened to be a thunderstorm, which really set the vibe when being alone. Anyway, my mom leaves at around 5, and my dad is still at work. Having the whole house to myself, I take an hour to study for a science test and play a few video games on the Wii. With it being the early 2000s, the Wii console was the hottest thing of the year. Those who grew up during that era will probably know what I'm talking about. Mid-game, I start to feel a little hungry and decide that I'd pause my game and go downstairs to grab a snack. As I make my way down, I notice the hall light that leads into the kitchen had been turned on. This was particularly strange as my parents never leave any lights on as they're very strict about saving electricity, so I was surprised they had forgotten. Anyway, I make my way down the stairs and turn into the kitchen where I see a man crouched down by our food pantry. He's holding a hammer in his hands that he obviously took from my dad's toolbox. I cover my mouth and slowly back away and went back upstairs to call the police on the home phone. I try to speak very softly into the phone and tell the operator that there was someone in my house who I didn't know. The only description that I could give was that he was tall and wearing a white shirt. Being only 11, my description was anything but helpful. The operator had said that it could take a while due to the extreme weather, but to just hide for as long as possible. I go into my closet, trying my best not to make a sound when I hear heavy footsteps come up the stairs. All the while, I'm praying that he doesn't find me as there was no possible way I could take him even if I tried. Then, as if things couldn't get any worse, they did. He's now at my door and he's lightly tapping on it, asking to come in this deep tone of voice. The more he knocked, the more his voice changed into anger. He then starts pounding on my door saying, "You know I could break this door down too easily, right, little girl?" At that point, I'm screaming the word no repeatedly when I hear police sirens coming down my street. However, that didn't seem to faze him as he kept pounding on my door before police came in, tackling him to the floor. I hear a lot of commotion happening outside my room before I hear a light knock on my door. I screamed, telling them no and that I didn't want to die. After I said that, I hear a female's voice tell me it's okay and that I could come out. I ever so slowly opened the door and was greeted to a female police officer and 3 other male officers restraining the man. He was even taller than I thought, maybe 6'6", and his eyes were bloodshot crazy. The female officer hugged me and calmly asked me if I knew this man, to which I replied with a no. Apparently, this guy had walked into my house through an unlocked door and made his way into the kitchen. Long story short, they take him away while I see him being forced into the backseat of the police car. The look on his face that day is something that will never leave me. It was a look of pure hatred, as if the first thing he'd do once he got out of jail would be to come back for me. My parents never left me home alone again until I turned 15. Even though I'm a lot older now, I still have fears of being home alone, and I always have to tell my fiancé to remember to lock the doors when he leaves for work. It's crazy to think that a childhood fear of mine still stuck with me throughout adulthood. I have kids now, and they will never go through what I went through. I would still sometimes get nightmares about that incident where he would always be banging on either me or my kids' doors attempting to kill us. Sometimes he succeeds. This took place when I was 10, when my family and I had just moved into a new home in 2001. My parents bought the house for a decent price, even though it was a newer house. The area it was located in wasn't the nicest or safest, and sirens would often be heard a few times a week. That being said, we never had any break-ins or robberies for a good while until a few months after we had moved in. My parents were going out for their 20th anniversary while my aunt came to watch over me. My aunt and I were really close and always adored me ever since I was born. I remember my aunt coming over and brought over a few Pokemon cards for me to play with. At one point, my aunt tells me that she's walking over to the local cafe for some coffee and that she'll be back soon. I didn't want to go with her as I obviously thought it was boring. That being said, I stuck to playing with my Pokemon cards while she was gone. Looking back, I really wish I had gone with her. Now let's fast forward till about 20 minutes later. I'm at the kitchen table eating some chips when the home phone rings. This was especially weird as the home phone almost never rang unless it was for my dad. Not thinking anything of it, I pick up and I immediately hear a man's voice from the other end say, Hi, is this the Vargas residence? To be clear, my last name is Vargas, and I figured it was probably someone for my dad. I tell him yes and ask who it is, to which he replied with Bob, which was the most basic name in the book. Bob then asks me for my name and where I lived, which I stupidly told him. Somewhere in Bakersfield, I think? Mind you, I didn't tell him my address as I didn't know it, but I did tell him the city. Right after, he then says, Alright, bud. Bye-bye now. I don't even remember thinking twice about it. I was only 10, so I didn't understand what I had just done. Suddenly, those conversations with my parents about never to talk to strangers came flooding in. That being said, I still thought it was someone for my dad. 30 minutes later, I was watching TV when I hear a knock on the door. Figuring it was my aunt back from her walk, I gladly answer it, but was instead greeted to a man I had never seen before. He was tall and muscular and, of course, introduced himself as Bob. The look of sheer panic on my face said it all as I knew it had to be the same guy from the phone. He asks if my parents were home, and when I told him no, he gave me this unsettling grin followed by a small chuckle. Not knowing what to do, I tell him to come back later when my parents were home. However, he didn't budge and put his foot through the door to block me from locking it. At this point, I'm clearly uncomfortable, and before I was about to say anything else, I hear my aunt's demanding voice tell him to leave. My aunt is ex-military, so she didn't take things lightly. The man turns around and books it down the street and into a white pickup truck. I remember my aunt trying to get the license plate, only to learn that it had been covered in duct tape. Thankfully, my aunt knew a lot about cars, so she was able to identify the year and model. From my understanding, she ended up reporting it to the police, but nothing ever became of it. I couldn't give the best description, and tracing a number back in 2001 was exceedingly difficult, even for police. That being said, my aunt did manage to snap a picture of the vehicle. This was around the time where cameras were being built into phones not even a year ago, so the quality of it was very grainy and fuzzy. That certainly didn't help the investigation, nor did we get any answers as to who was in that truck. My parents scolded my aunt for this, but thanked her for getting back in time. We moved out of that house a few months later, and my aunt unfortunately passed away from cancer 2 years later. I still thank her for stepping in and coming back at the right time. If she had come back even 10 minutes later, God only knows what would have happened to me. For context, I'm a female, and this happened just last week when I was in my first semester of college. I attended a community college right near my house, as it was more convenient for me to get to and from school. Anyway, last week I had just gotten home from my first day of classes and threw myself onto my bed to relax. Being at school for long hours was enough to make me exhausted, and sleep was the only thing I was looking forward to. I get some shut-eye for a good hour or so when I woke to my dog Mia barking. This was weird as she almost never barks. I have a dachshund, big bark, small bite, and was the sweetest thing anyone could have, so when I heard her barking, I definitely thought it was strange. I dismissed it as her just barking at someone walking their dog or cat. However, it wasn't until her barks went from annoying to defensive, and that's when I get up to see what she was barking at. I could then see her barking into my parents' bedroom. She has her head up while barking as if she were barking at a person. The only problem was that there wasn't anyone there, even though she clearly knew something was there. At this point, I'm officially creeped the hell out while trying to get her to snap out of it. As I was about to approach her, she squeals back as if she was hurt or scared. I take a look at her and I see this minor gash above her stomach where I then covered it. Thankfully, there wasn't that much blood, but it still hurt her to say the least. I grabbed Mia and ran out of that house so fast to call the police. When my parents got home, I had told them about what had happened prior to them arriving. However, my parents are the type of people to take everything so lightly and lectured me about how I haven't been sleeping well enough and that it was all in my head. I know my story sounds crazy, but I saw it happen. I don't care if my parents believed me or not, as I know what I saw. Nothing has happened since, and my dog has gotten back to her normal self. This is by far the scariest thing I've ever seen, as I still can't find the words to explain it. I've had a few people tell me that it was just my dog being dumb, while others say it was something paranormal related. All of these theories were valid, but unfortunately, the second one seems more plausible. I'm not sure what exactly happened, but what I do know is that my dog obviously saw something in that room that I couldn't see, that terrified her.